When someone breaks out in a rash every time they go into the sun, starts walking like they are off balance, and suddenly loses control of their emotions, what would you think of first? Most people would think a skin problem, a neurological problem, or a psychiatric disorder. But sometimes the real problem is not the emotions and not just the skin. Sometimes the real issue is an inborn error of metabolism, or IEM, that is extremely good at disguising itself. It is called Hartnup disease. This is a genetic metabolic disorder that can look like a neurological disorder or a psychiatric one. That is exactly what makes it so deceptive. At the beginning, it often does not look like a metabolic disease at all. It may first look like a skin condition. After sun exposure, a person may develop a pellagra-like photosensitive rash. Then it may start to look like a neurological problem. They may become unsteady on their feet, feel as if they are drifting, develop ataxia, dizziness, seizures, and in severe cases, even sudden collapse. Later on, it may start to look like a psychiatric disorder. The person may develop emotional instability, anxiety, unusual behavior, and sometimes even delusions, hallucinations, or psychosis-like symptoms. In other words, this disease often crosses the boundaries between dermatology, neurology, psychiatry, and metabolic medicine. If you focus only on labels like rash, emotional problems, or trouble walking, the clues can easily get pulled apart, and in the end, it can look like a collection of small, unrelated problems. But in reality, they may all be coming from the same cause. Hartnup disease is not simply a story about vitamin deficiency. It is just that when symptoms appear, they often show up first in the skin, the nervous system, or the mind. The real core problem begins in the intestines and the kidneys. More precisely, the defect is in neutral amino acid transport. So this is not ordinary pellagra caused by primary dietary niacin deficiency, but many of its flare-ups are closely related to secondary deficiency of tryptophan and niacin. This disease was first described in 1956 in a British family. Then, in 2004, molecular genetics confirmed that the key disease-causing gene is SLC6A19. But here is one very important point. Not everyone with this biochemical abnormality will develop clear symptoms. Why? Because the body still has a kind of backup route. Even though transport of free neutral amino acids is impaired, oligopeptide absorption can still provide partial compensation. You can think of it like this. The main highway is damaged, but there are still side roads that remain open. That is why many people who meet the biochemical criteria can remain almost symptom-free for years, especially when their nutrition is good. But in the smaller group who do develop symptoms, once they run into an infection, a fever, physical stress, malnutrition, sun exposure, or exposure to photosensitizing drugs, the symptoms can suddenly emerge. And these episodes usually do not happen every single day. They tend to come and go. Sometimes the main problem is a photosensitive rash. Sometimes it is ataxia. Sometimes it is anxiety, mood swings, depression, or even psychotic symptoms. Some people also develop eye-related symptoms, including photophobia, nystagmus, double vision, and strabismus. Most reported cases are more common in childhood, especially between ages 3 and 9, but it can also appear earlier, even as early as 10 days after birth, and it can also appear later, with some people not being diagnosed until early adulthood. Chapter 1. A real patient story. What makes some inherited metabolic disorders so dangerous is not how rare they are. It is this: they are incredibly good at hiding. In this case, the patient was a young man in his 20s. At first, it was just anxiety. Later, it became depression, agitation, and weight loss. Then, things got worse. He became withdrawn. He stopped eating. He stopped speaking. Eventually, he became bedridden. He even underwent electroconvulsive therapy, and still, his condition kept getting worse. Only at the very end did doctors realize this was not simply a psychiatric problem, and it was not just a neurological problem either. What had been hiding underneath was an overlooked inborn error of metabolism: Hartnup disease. Scene 1. When everything looks like anxiety getting worse. At the beginning, almost no one would think first of an inherited metabolic disorder. This patient was in his 20s. He came from a German family. There was no history of consanguinity. His mother had an uncomplicated pregnancy. His birth was normal. His early development also appeared normal. But from early on, his family had noticed two small things. Neither seemed important at the time. First, he especially loved eating eggs. Second, he kept getting recurrent papules on his skin, especially on sun-exposed areas. They kept coming back again and again. Back then, none of this looked like the beginning of a serious disease. It looked more like a handful of vague, scattered, hard-to-explain little problems. Scene 2. When it starts with psychiatric symptoms, it is easiest to let your guard down. At age 17, the problem officially entered his psychiatric record. He was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. He also received psychotherapy. Later, while he was abroad as an exchange student, things began to change. First, his appetite declined. Then, he developed anorexia. After that, his overall condition started to fall apart. He became depressed, then increasingly agitated. His weight also began to drop little by little. Eventually, he had to return to Germany and was admitted to a psychiatric unit. At that time, his brain MRI was still normal. Scene 3. What was truly frightening was not just that he was suffering, it was that he was beginning to stop responding to the world. After he was admitted to psychiatry, he received psychotherapy and antidepressant treatment. But instead of recovering the way a more typical psychiatric disorder might, he kept slipping further downward. His anxiety worsened. His weight kept falling. Then he became more and more withdrawn. He began refusing food. If you only write those words on paper, they look like a list of symptoms: depression, agitation, worsening anxiety, social withdrawal, refusal to eat. But when you place them back into a real human life, the picture becomes something else entirely. This was a young man who had once been able to study, to live, and to engage with the world. And little by little, he pulled himself away from it. He stopped talking. He stopped eating. He stopped participating. It was as if his whole self were being trapped inside a shell that kept getting thicker. Scene 4. 6 weeks was enough to push someone from speaking to mutism and being bedridden. His illness did not stop at the stage of emotional instability. It kept moving into far more dangerous territory. Just 6 weeks after psychiatric admission, he was already bedridden. Then came mutism, fever, and elevated creatine kinase. At that point, it was not surprising that clinicians treated him as a case of malignant catatonia, because by then, this no longer looked like simple anxiety or depression. He seemed to be entering a much more dangerous state, somewhere at the border between psychiatry and neurology. He was still physically there, but it felt as if he was gradually losing the ability to respond to the world around him. So the doctors used lorazepam. They used olanzapine. Eventually, they even used electroconvulsive therapy. But even then, his condition continued to decline. Scene 5. When a psychiatric patient starts showing more and more neurological signs, sometimes what breaks apart the original diagnosis is not a single lab result. Sometimes the body starts sending alarms in other ways. As his condition worsened, he was transferred to neurology, and by then the doctors were no longer looking at just a person losing emotional control. They were looking at a young patient whose entire system seemed to be falling apart. By the time he arrived in neurology, his condition had gone far beyond worsening anxiety. His level of consciousness was reduced. He was not speaking. He showed no purposeful movements, and yet he still appeared clearly anxious. Neurologically, he had developed spastic quadriparesis. His deep tendon reflexes were reduced. He also had symmetrical distal loss of pain sensation. On general examination, he was found to have eczema-like skin lesions and signs of malnutrition. His BMI was only 19. What is especially worth pausing over here is this: his psychiatric symptoms had not disappeared. They had simply become wrapped inside a much broader pattern of neurological abnormality. In this one patient, psychiatric symptoms, neurological signs, skin findings, and nutritional decline all began to tangle together like threads from completely different specialties, suddenly tied into one knot. Scene 6. The imaging got worse, but the answer still did not come. The most painful cases are not the ones with no abnormalities at all. They are the ones where more and more abnormalities appear, but the real answer still refuses to show itself. His EEG was normal, but EMG and nerve conduction studies suggested lower motor neuron dysfunction. Even more unsettling, only 8 weeks after his first normal MRI, repeat imaging showed leukoencephalopathy and progressive cerebral atrophy. The imaging was worsening, the clinical picture was worsening, and the patient himself was worsening. At that point, most doctors would almost instinctively ask, could this be encephalitis? Could this be some kind of rapidly progressive inflammatory encephalopathy? And in fact, that was exactly the direction the clinical team was pursuing. Scene 7. Even the path of autoimmune encephalitis did not bring him back. The most helpless moments are often not the moments when there is no treatment. They are the moments when every reasonable explanation has already been tried and the patient still does not improve. He underwent repeated cerebrospinal fluid studies. They remained unremarkable. Even the antibodies associated with autoimmune encephalitis did not provide supporting evidence, and yet the team still proceeded with plasma exchange. Later, he was treated with high-dose corticosteroids and intravenous immunoglobulin. For the family, and for the clinical team as well, this is often the heaviest stretch of all, because the most aggressive treatments have already been tried, and still, the patient does not come back. In the end, he even required a nasogastric tube and standard formula feeding. Scene 8. The real answer did not come from antibodies. It came from amino acids. The truth behind some diseases is not hidden inside the loudest diagnosis. Sometimes it is hidden in the most basic metabolic clues. At last, the turning point arrived. Metabolic testing showed generalized aminoaciduria, while urinary organic acids were normal. His plasma amino acid profile showed low levels of threonine, leucine, asparagine, and histidine, all neutral amino acids, and tryptophan was not detected at all. Then, whole exome sequencing and family segregation analysis revealed more. He carried compound heterozygous variants in SLC6A19. One was a known pathogenic variant. The other was a novel variant, considered likely pathogenic. At that point, this case, which had looked like worsening anxiety, out of control depression, catatonia, or encephalitis, finally came back together in its true form. At last, the real diagnosis surfaced: Hartnup disease. And only then did all of those scattered details from earlier suddenly make sense. The recurrent papules he had had since childhood, worse in sun-exposed areas, and his long-standing preference for eggs. Of course, loving eggs may simply have been a personal food preference. It is also possible that with long-term limitations in amino acid availability, his body may have developed a spontaneous preference for high-protein foods. But the current literature is not strong enough to treat that as a definitive feature of Hartnup disease. Scene 9. Once the direction was right, his body responded almost as if it recognized the treatment. The most striking part of this case was not simply that the diagnosis was finally found. It was this: once the diagnosis was made, the patient actually began to come back. After Hartnup disease was diagnosed, his treatment changed. He was started on a high-protein formula. He received niacin. He also received intravenous amino acid supplementation, including daily tryptophan. And then, the change came surprisingly quickly. Within 1 week, he was able to hold a cup and drink by himself. He could eat prepared food. He could also speak in short sentences. 4 weeks later, he was able to remain awake for sustained periods. His speech became more organized. He could even remember conversations from several days earlier. Although his interactions still seemed childlike, his spasticity had disappeared, and his peripheral weakness had improved somewhat. He was able to sit independently, and with assistance, he could stand for as long as 20 minutes. 4 months later, his plasma amino acids had returned to normal. His communication and behavior were now close to age appropriate. His spasticity had almost completely resolved. His walking had also improved. But his polyneuropathy showed no clear improvement. And that reminds us of something important. Even in a treatable inborn error of metabolism, if the diagnosis comes too late, some of the damage may not be fully reversible. But that is also what makes this case so powerful. The symptoms that had once been explained as worsening anxiety, catatonia, or encephalitis were not beyond recovery forever. Once the true cause was identified, at least some of those symptoms could improve in a very meaningful way. Scene 10. What matters most about this case is not only the name of the disease, it is the diagnostic warning it leaves behind. When psychiatric symptoms progress too fast and are accompanied by neurological signs and other physical clues, do not rule out a metabolic disorder too early. The takeaway from this case is actually very clear. If a person develops rapidly progressive neuropsychiatric symptoms, especially when there are also additional neurological findings and standard treatment is not working, then metabolic evaluation should be considered. Whole exome sequencing should also be considered. In other words, what this case truly teaches us is not only that Hartnup disease can begin in adulthood with psychiatric symptoms. More importantly, some conditions that look like psychiatric emergencies may actually have an identifiable inherited metabolic cause standing behind them. Summary of this chapter. The diseases that are best at disguising themselves are not always the rarest. Very often, they are the ones that look the most like common explanations. In this case, the anxiety was real. The depression and agitation were real. The withdrawal, refusal to eat, mutism, and being bedridden, all of that was real too. The problem is not that these symptoms did not look psychiatric. The problem is this: they did not belong only to psychiatry. When psychiatric symptoms suddenly worsen and progress rapidly, and the patient also has skin findings, weight loss, neurological signs, and poor response to standard treatment, then it may be time to ask one more question. Is this really just a primary psychiatric disorder? Or is the real problem something deeper, hidden in the body's metabolic system? Chapter 2. What exactly is Hartnup disease? If you had to explain it in one sentence, it is not the classic story of a broken enzyme. Instead, it is a broken transport gate. Hartnup disease is an autosomal recessive genetic disorder. In most cases, it happens when both copies of the SLC6A19 gene are affected. This gene provides instructions for making a transport protein called B0AT1. That protein is found mainly in the intestinal epithelium and in the proximal tubules of the kidneys. Its job is simple, but it is essential. Under normal conditions, it helps move a group of neutral amino acids from the intestine into the body. At the same time, it also helps recover those same amino acids before they are lost in the urine, pulling them back into the bloodstream. You can think of it as the gate at a metabolic shipping center. The raw materials from food have to pass through that gate to get in. And the raw materials that have already been filtered into the urine also depend on that gate to be reclaimed. But once that gate breaks, the problem begins. Amino acids start being lost from both sides. On one side, they are not absorbed properly. On the other, they cannot be retained. The end result is this: more neutral amino acids spill into the urine. That is what we call neutral aminoaciduria. Chapter 3. Where does the process actually break down? If you imagine the human body as a city, then amino acids are the raw materials that have to be delivered every single day. And in Hartnup disease, the problem is not that the raw materials were never eaten. The problem is this: the transport system is damaged. In the intestine, the B0AT1 protein helps move certain neutral amino acids from food into epithelial cells. In the kidney, it helps reclaim those same amino acids after they have already been filtered into the forming urine. So the key problem here is not simply not eating enough. The problem is this: the nutrients come in, but they cannot be transported properly. They get filtered, but they cannot be recovered. There is another important point here, because this is where many people get confused. Hartnup disease does not affect only tryptophan. It disrupts the transport of multiple neutral amino acids. Tryptophan just happens to be especially important because it is so closely tied to niacin and to precursors for neurotransmitters. That is why, clinically, Tryptophan often looks like the most visible piece of the puzzle. You can think of the whole process like this. When SLC6A19 or B0AT1 does not work properly, intestinal absorption is impaired. Renal tubular reabsorption is also impaired. More neutral amino acids are lost in the urine. Tryptophan availability drops. The production of niacin and niacinamide is affected, and in the end, the patient may develop a pellagra-like rash and neuropsychiatric episodes. Chapter 4. Why does a transport disorder in the intestine and kidneys end up affecting the brain? The key molecule here is tryptophan. Tryptophan is an essential amino acid. It is not just a building block for protein. It is also a precursor for many important molecules. These include NAD, NADP, kynurenic acid, melatonin, and serotonin. It is also one of the body's important sources for making niacin. And niacin and niacinamide are closely tied to molecules like NAD and NADP, which are involved in a huge range of energy metabolism. That helps explain why Hartnup disease so often affects first the tissues that turn over quickly and use a great deal of energy, like the skin, like the gut, and like the brain. So this is not simply a story about losing a few amino acids in the urine. It is more like the cell's energy system is being pulled down with it. When nutrition is still adequate, the body may be able to hold things together, at least for a while. But once fever, infection, poor nutrition, or other forms of stress enter the picture, the symptoms can begin to surface. There is another layer too. When tryptophan is not properly absorbed, more of it remains behind in the gut. And when that leftover tryptophan gets metabolized, it can lead to higher levels of indole compounds and kynurenine-related products. Those changes may also play a role in the development of neurological symptoms. If we make the mechanism even more straightforward, you can think of it as having 4 layers. The first layer is this: not enough niacin. Right now, this is the layer with the strongest evidence, because when transport breaks down, more tryptophan is lost. That means the body has less substrate available to make niacin. And once the niacin pathway is affected, it becomes easier to develop a pellagra-like rash and neuropsychiatric episodes. That is why many people understand Hartnup disease as an inherited amino acid transport disorder that can produce pellagra-like features. The second layer is this: when tryptophan drops, the brain also has less downstream material to work with. That matters because tryptophan is an upstream precursor for both serotonin and melatonin. So in theory, when its availability stays low over time, mood, sleep, behavioral regulation, and the stress response may all be affected. This mechanism cannot be directly measured in every patient, but at present it remains a very important logical framework for understanding the neuropsychiatric symptoms. The third layer is this: metabolic byproducts from the gut may be adding to the problem. Because more unabsorbed tryptophan is left behind, the gut microbiome can convert it into more indole-derived metabolites. Some of those metabolites are thought to be unfriendly to the nervous system and may even carry a certain degree of toxicity. That said, this third layer is still considered a candidate mechanism. The evidence for it is weaker than for the others, so this disease does not look like just one pathway going wrong. It looks more like 3 problems stacked on top of each other. not enough substrate, disruption of the vitamin pathway, and increased gut-derived metabolic byproducts. And then there is a fourth layer, a newer hypothesis that has emerged in recent years. For a long time, people believed that the neurological symptoms in Hartnup disease were mainly an indirect consequence of systemic deficiency of tryptophan and niacin. That was partly because earlier work had not found clear evidence of B0AT1 expression in the brain. But in 2023, a study based on high-resolution transcriptomic data offered a new clue. It suggested that SLC6A19 expression may also be present in ependymal cells in the mouse brain. If that finding holds up, it would mean that the brain-related problems in Hartnup disease may not be explained only by not enough raw material throughout the body. They may also involve how amino acids are handled at the interface between the cerebrospinal fluid and the ependymal lining. Of course, this is still a research stage hypothesis. It should not be treated as an established clinical fact, but at the very least, it reminds us of something important. The brain story in Hartnup disease may be more complicated than what older textbooks suggested. Chapter 5. How do clinicians recognize it? And what does the diagnosis actually rely on? So here is the real question. How do doctors even think of this disease in the first place? The answer is not from one single symptom. It usually starts with a cluster of clues. At first, those clues may look scattered, but when you put them together, they start to form a pattern. If a child or a young adult keeps showing this kind of combination, it is worth stopping and asking, could this be more than a skin problem? Could it be more than an emotional or psychiatric issue? For example, a rash that gets worse after sun exposure, a rash that looks pellagra-like, a rash that is especially sensitive to sunlight. Some patients also have gastrointestinal symptoms, such as chronic diarrhea. In some people, the eyes can also send signals. Light sensitivity, nystagmus, double vision, strabismus, and beyond that, neurologic and motor symptoms can also show up. Low muscle tone, spasticity, tremor, delayed motor development, and then there are the episodic symptoms: unsteady walking, ataxia, seizures, headaches, and sometimes even sudden collapse, pause, or fainting. But the part that most easily sends people in the wrong direction is often the psychiatric and behavioural side. Some patients may show emotional instability, anxiety, depression, and unusual behaviour. Some may even develop delusions, hallucinations, delirium, or autism-like features. And that is exactly why Hartnup disease can be mistaken so easily for a primary psychiatric disorder. But here is one very important point. Most patients actually have overall normal development and normal intelligence. Clear intellectual disability has only been reported in a minority of cases. And these episodes usually do not come out of nowhere. They tend to be triggered by infection, fever, poor nutrition, physical stress, and sun exposure, especially in the spring and summer. In other words, the disease is not equally severe every day. It often comes in episodes, and that makes it harder. Because some patients do not present with the full textbook picture at the beginning. Some may have mainly neurologic symptoms. Some may have mostly psychiatric symptoms. And yes, some people really are misdiagnosed for years. So the absence of a rash does not mean you can confidently rule out Hartnup disease. The real diagnostic clue is not just the rash. And it is not just the psychiatric symptoms either. What you really need to look for is the key metabolic evidence, and in most cases, the most important test is this: urine amino acid analysis, because the classic biochemical hallmark of Hartnup disease is excessive loss of neutral amino acids in the urine. You can think of it this way: these are raw materials the body was supposed to reabsorb but failed to hold on to, so they end up spilling into the urine. On urine amino acid testing, you often see elevations in multiple neutral amino acids. For example, alanine, serine, threonine, valine, leucine, isoleucine, phenylalanine, tyrosine, asparagine, glutamine, tryptophan, histidine, citrulline, and others. In addition, urinary indole compounds and other breakdown products of tryptophan can provide supportive clues. But this part also has to be interpreted carefully. You cannot say, neutral amino acids are elevated, therefore this must be Hartnup disease. It is not that simple, because in some patients, you may also see elevations in amino acids that are not considered the most classic pattern. So diagnosis is not about forcing everything to fit one lab result. It is about putting together the clinical picture, the metabolic testing, and the genetic findings. There is also another detail that can be misleading. Plasma amino acids may sometimes look close to normal, or only mildly abnormal. Why? Because even though free amino acid transport is impaired, peptide absorption is still partially preserved. So if plasma amino acids look relatively okay, that still does not rule out Hartnup disease. And in the end, once there is clinical suspicion and biochemical screening has pointed in this direction, genetic testing is needed for confirmation. The main gene to look at is SLC6A19. So the most reliable approach usually looks like this. First, suspect it from the pattern of symptoms. Second, use biochemical testing to capture the metabolic clues. And third, confirm the diagnosis with genetic testing. That is the more solid and dependable pathway. Of course, clinicians also have to consider other possible diagnoses, including simple pellagra and other disorders that can also cause aminoaciduria, photosensitive rashes, or neurologic symptoms. So Hartnup disease cannot be diagnosed by mechanically applying a triad like Rash, Ataxia, and psychiatric symptoms. Real patients rarely read the textbook. Some are atypical, some have only part of the picture, and some have almost no obvious symptoms at all. In fact, some patients are only discovered through newborn screening or incidental urine screening. Clinically, they may seem almost completely well, and when classic episodes do happen in Hartnup disease, they often develop over the course of days, last about 1 to 4 weeks, and then improve. Many symptoms ease as the trigger resolves, but the amino acid abnormality in the urine may persist. So in the end, the two most important steps are still these. First, think of the diagnosis. Second, use biochemical testing to catch the clues. Genetic testing then helps confirm the cause and supports future genetic counselling. Chapter 6. How is Hartnup disease treated? At this point, the next question most people ask is, can it actually be treated? And the answer is, yes. It can be managed, and in quite a few patients, the improvement can be very real. That is one of the most important things to know about Hartnup disease. This is not one of those disorders where making the diagnosis changes nothing. The treatment strategy fits the logic of a metabolic disease. If the problem is insufficient supply along the tryptophan and niacin pathway, then treatment focuses on two goals: replace what is lacking and reduce the triggers that push symptoms worse. Authoritative sources consistently emphasize several core measures. First, a high-protein diet with good overall nutrition, because patients who are malnourished are more likely to have episodes, and when the diet is already limited or protein intake is already low, symptoms can become much more pronounced. Second, supplementation with niacin or nicotinamide. This is a very important part of treatment. Common doses are roughly in the range of 40 to 200 milligrams per day. But that does not mean people should decide the dose on their own. Different patients tolerate treatment differently, and their responses are not the same. So this part needs to be guided and monitored by a physician. With appropriate treatment, many patients can improve, including both the skin findings and the neurologic symptoms. But there is an important warning here. If the diagnosis is delayed for too long, some neurologic damage may not be fully reversible. Peripheral neuropathy, in particular, may sometimes persist. Third, as much as possible, avoid the triggers. That includes sun exposure, fever, malnutrition, physical stress, and medications that can worsen photosensitivity, especially sulfonamides. That may sound simple, but in real life, it matters a great deal, because in many patients, those are exactly the factors that help push an episode into the open. And if the neurologic or psychiatric symptoms are severe, management cannot rely on just one specialty. These patients often need neurology, psychiatry, and a metabolic genetics team working together. Overall, the prognosis for Hartnup disease is usually fairly good. In many people, episodes become less frequent with age, and even more importantly, when the diagnosis is finally recognized, many patients see clear reductions in both the frequency and severity of attacks. More recent neurogenetic case reports have even suggested that when Hartnup disease is correctly identified, when nutrition is optimized, and when niacin replacement is put in place, some neuropsychiatric symptoms can improve quite substantially. And that is why, for a genetic metabolic disorder that can be screened for, recognized, and treated, the most dangerous part is not that it is rare. The real danger is this. The clues are there, the direction is there, and yet the patient keeps getting treated as if it were something else, going in circles down the wrong road. That is one of the most important lessons of Hartnup disease. It reminds us that a patient who looks like they have a skin disorder, a psychiatric disorder, or a neurologic disorder may actually have a problem with amino acid transport. A child who seems to have something off emotionally may actually have a deeper problem in the entire pathway involving tryptophan, niacin, and energy metabolism. And a case that is always worse after sun exposure, after fever, or during poor nutrition may not simply reflect a sensitive constitution. It may be the body's way of telling you this: there could be a treatable, screenable, genetic metabolic disorder underneath. What deserves the most caution is not the word rare. It is the possibility that a disease with real clues and even real treatment options gets misread for years as a primary psychiatric disorder, a simple skin disease, or some vague and unexplained tendency. In closing, Hartnup disease is not the most common inherited metabolic disorder, but it is a very revealing one. On the surface, it can look psychiatric. It can look neurologic. But one layer deeper, the real problem is a breakdown in the body's metabolic transport system. It reminds us that the body is not made of separate machines running the skin, the gut, the kidneys, and the brain all on their own. It is much more like an interconnected metabolic network. A small transporter protein located at the brush border of the intestine and the proximal renal tubule can fail, and what shows up clinically may involve the skin, the nervous system, and the mind. And one more important note: this content is intended for education and public medical awareness. It is not a substitute for personal diagnosis or medical treatment. The diagnosis of Hartnup disease depends on metabolic and genetic testing. It should not be assumed based only on a rash, mood changes, or unsteady walking. And supplements such as niacin or nicotinamide should also be evaluated by a qualified physician based on age, nutritional status, liver function, symptom severity, and genetic findings. Please do not self-medicate.